The wind cut through the valley like a blade, dragging with it the scent of ash, dust, and something ancient, something forgotten. No one noticed the boy when he arrived, barefoot and hollow-eyed, dragging behind him nothing but silence and a name no one cared to ask. He wasn't looking for gold, glory, or even kindness. All he wanted was a roof, 4 walls to keep the cold out and the memories at bay. But in a town ruled by fear, where even the sun seemed hesitant to shine, no soul gives without taking double in return. He found shelter not in a church, nor in a barn, but in the house of a widow known by every man as the shadow of death. They whispered that she was cursed, that the blood of her husband, the most feared warrior this land had ever seen, still clung to her doorstep. She hadn't smiled in over 10 winters, and no man dared cross her path unless he wished to be buried beside the last fool who tried. So why did she take the boy in? Why did she offer him bread, warmth, and a future? What happened inside those walls would turn the town upside down. It started with silence, but ended in gunfire and tears. Because sometimes, mercy looks like madness. And sometimes, the loneliest hearts recognize each other long before the world understands what it's seeing. He was no longer just a boy, and she was no longer just a widow. By the time the town noticed what had unfolded, it was too late. The lines between pity and passion had blurred, and what began as charity became a bond so unbreakable, not even fire, bullet, or betrayal could sever it. They said it was wrong. They said it was unnatural. But those who looked deeper saw something else, something sacred born from suffering. And it all started because an orphan knocked on the wrong door on the wrong night, only to find exactly what he'd been missing all along. The boy's name was Eli, and he spoke with the weight of someone who had lived far more years than his skin betrayed. No one knew where he came from, just that he'd wandered down the ridge at dusk, clothes torn, face bruised by sun and wind, eyes sharp with a silence that unnerved even the saloon drunkards. In the Old West, orphans were often ignored, used, or worse. But Eli didn't beg. He didn't cry. He simply stood outside that widow's door, as if he knew it was the only one that would open. Inside, she was carving meat. Not for guests. She never had any. Her name was May Callahan, and whispers said she once held her dying husband's hand as he bled out after facing 12 men alone in a canyon ambush. Since then, her house stood as still as a tomb. Yet, when she opened that door and saw Eli, cold, cracked lips, defiant stare, she didn't slam it shut. She tilted her head, blinked once, and stepped aside without a word. That night, the townsfolk spotted smoke rising from her chimney again, a sight unseen in years. They speculated wildly. Some said it was a curse being passed on. Others swore she was losing her mind. But Eli didn't care. He had warmth, a roof, and a chair to sit in. He didn't ask for more, and May didn't offer it. They were 2 ghosts living in the same haunted house, bound by silence deeper than blood. Over time, the silence turned into glances. Glances turned into short nods. And eventually, the walls that both had built out of grief and fear began to soften. May would toss him a piece of cornbread without looking. He would patch the leaking roof without being asked. There were no thanks, no smiles, no questions, only actions. And in the Old West, action spoke more than prayers. But not everyone appreciated the strange bond growing inside that cabin. The sheriff began to watch. The preacher started to murmur. And one night at the saloon, a rancher spat into his glass and asked, "What's she doing with that stray?" The West had rules, unwritten, unkind, and no one liked seeing them broken by a woman they feared and a boy they didn't understand. The first sign that things were shifting came when May rode into town with Eli beside her. She hadn't been seen on horseback in years, and no one had ever seen her with company. Eli sat straight, his clothes clean, hat slightly too big for his head but worn with pride. The town's breath caught, not because of scandal, but because something about them looked right, as if they belonged to a story bigger than anyone there could comprehend. At the general store, May spoke Eli's name aloud for the first time. "He'll need boots," she said to the clerk. Her voice cut through the murmurs like a whip. And that clerk, a man who had once refused to sell her a lantern because a woman ought not to live alone in the hills, simply nodded and fetched the finest pair he had. That moment marked something unspoken, a shift in power, a crack in the rules the town had written for others, but never for her. But change invites unrest. And the unrest came in the form of Duke Harmon, a former friend of May's husband and a man who never forgave her for rejecting his proposal after the burial. Duke had always believed the land May owned should have been his. And now that she had someone beside her, someone who looked too young to fight back, he saw an opportunity. That boy's got no right to her land, Duke muttered to anyone who'd listen. He's just a squatter in boots too big. May knew trouble was coming. She could feel it in her bones, the same way she'd felt it the night her husband rode off and never returned. She didn't tell Eli. Instead, she began teaching him how to load a rifle, how to spot footprints in the dirt, how to listen for danger when the desert went too quiet. They didn't speak of fear. In the West, you didn't. You just prepared for the moment when the wind would shift. And shift it did. One evening, as the sun melted into blood-red horizon, 3 riders appeared near their fence line. They didn't dismount. They didn't call out. They simply watched. Eli stood on the porch, rifle in hand, heart pounding, but arms steady. May stepped beside him. No words. Just a long, cold silence between them and the men on horses. In the Old West, that silence was louder than thunder, and war was often born in it. That night, sleep didn't come. May sat by the fireplace, oil lamp casting flickering shadows across the walls, while Eli pretended to rest on a cot nearby. But his eyes stayed open, fixed on her. She looked different, less like the ghost she once was, and more like a woman who remembered how to fight. Her hands, though aged and weathered, moved with purpose as she sharpened the old hunting knife once used by her late husband. Every scrape of steel against stone was a vow whispered into the dark. Eli finally spoke, his voice barely above the crackle of fire. "Will they come back?" May didn't look up. "They never really left," she said, eyes fixed on the blade. That was the truth of the frontier. Danger didn't always knock. Sometimes it just waited outside, watching. Eli knew now that staying under her roof meant inheriting more than shelter. It meant stepping into a story written in blood and stubbornness. And he was ready. Or at least, he hoped he was. Over the next days, the air grew heavier. Duke Harmon's men were seen riding past again, each time a little closer to the cabin. They didn't speak, didn't threaten, but every rider left a message just by being there. This isn't over. The townsfolk, curious and fearful, began to keep their distance. Children were pulled inside early. Doors shut faster. And in the saloon, they stopped mentioning May's name altogether, as if pretending she didn't exist would erase the powder keg waiting to explode. May, however, refused to cower. She plowed the field. She fed the chickens. She cleaned the rifle. And she taught Eli how to stand without trembling. One afternoon, she led him to the gravesite of her husband, a small stone under a lone tree behind the house. "He died because he trusted the wrong man," she said. "I don't plan to make that mistake again." She placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, and for the first time, he felt something close to being chosen. Not out of pity, but out of belief. As dusk fell, a cold wind swept across the hills. Eli looked out from the porch, watching dust trails in the distance. He wasn't just protecting a roof anymore. He was protecting a bond. Fragile, strange, but real. The West didn't care about blood ties or paperwork. It cared about loyalty. And in May's eyes, he saw it. Clear, unwavering. They weren't just allies now. They were family. And families, out here, fought like wolves when cornered. Duke Harmon made his move at dawn. The sky was still bruised with the last traces of night when the rumble of hooves broke the silence. Eli was the first to hear them. He nudged May gently, and by the time she opened her eyes, he was already pulling his boots on, rifle in hand. She didn't panic. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, stood, and walked toward the door like a soldier answering an old call. 3 men rode up, Duke at the center, face worn but smug, as if the land itself owed him a favor. "Mornin', May," he called, resting one hand lazily on the butt of his revolver. "Didn't mean to wake the whole household. Just came to talk." May stepped out slowly, her shotgun resting across her arm like a sleeping beast. "Then talk from your saddle, Duke," she said coldly. "You ain't welcome here." He laughed, dismounting anyway. "This land ain't meant for orphans and widows," he said, spitting on the ground. "It's meant for men who know what to do with it." Eli appeared at the door, silent but steady, the rifle aimed just low enough not to be a threat. Yet, Duke eyed him with a grin. "Is that your new man of the house, May? Looks like he still needs milking." The insult hung in the air like smoke. May didn't blink. "You step 1 foot closer, and he'll send you limping back to town," she replied. Her voice was steel. And Duke, despite his arrogance, knew that tone. He'd heard it before, right before her husband carved through 6 outlaws to protect this very land. He raised both hands and took a step back. "You've got spirit, but that boy ain't gonna save you next time," he warned. "This place, this roof, it won't last." After they rode off, Eli turned to May. "Why didn't you shoot?" She exhaled slowly. "Because there's a time for fire and a time for patience." Then she looked at him and added, "But next time, if I'm not on that porch, you shoot first." Eli didn't flinch. He understood now. This wasn't about bravery. It was about survival. And the West had a cruel way of testing who deserved to remain standing. That evening, the sky turned the color of rust. Thunder rolled low in the distance, not from clouds, but from tension building in the dirt. Eli sat on the porch steps, oiling the rifle like May had taught him. Every movement was deliberate, every breath controlled. Inside, May boiled coffee in a tin pot. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was the kind that forms between warriors on the eve of something inevitable. May finally spoke. "You still want to stay?" Eli looked up, confused. She didn't repeat herself. She just waited. "You took me in," he said. "I didn't ask you to." "No," she agreed. "But I did." That was her way of saying she'd fight for him. That he mattered more than land, more than history. It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration. And in that moment, Eli knew that leaving was no longer an option. Not because of gratitude, but because loyalty had taken root. The next day, they worked the land as if nothing had happened. May guided the mule while Eli secured the fencing. Routine was their armor. In the West, the strongest didn't roar, they endured. And May, though hardened by years of sorrow, moved with a kind of quiet resilience that taught Eli more than any sermon could. She didn't speak of God, but she lived like someone who knew the weight of judgment and chose to keep standing anyway. Trouble came again at sundown. This time, it wasn't Duke, but 2 of his men, sent to deliver a warning. They thought they could intimidate a widow and a boy. What they didn't expect was the rifle barrel poking through the upstairs window before they reached the porch. One of them froze. The other laughed, until May stepped out behind them, revolver drawn and eyes colder than a northern creek. "You've got 10 seconds to turn around," she said. After that, I stopped counting. They left. Fast. Dust trailed behind their horses like a signal fire. Eli watched from the window, heart pounding, hands steady. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply whispered, "They'll come back." May nodded from below. "Then we'll be ready." In the Old West, the moments between violence mattered just as much as the violence itself, because that's when characters were forged, not through killing, but through the choice to keep defending what was worth living for. The town was changing too, though no one would admit it. Whispers filled the saloon. "She's turned that boy into something dangerous." Others said, "Maybe it's him who gave her something to live for." The preacher, once loud in condemning her solitude, now walked the other way when she rode into town. People didn't dare meet her eyes, but they didn't mock her anymore either. Respect, in the West, often came after fear. And fear, May commanded without raising her voice. Eli began to change too, not into a man by age, but by presence. He moved like someone who belonged. He spoke less, listened more. He learned to read the land, where the coyotes nested, when the wind carried danger, how to spot a rider long before the dust arrived. And at night, when May sat on the porch with a lantern and cup of coffee, he sat beside her. Neither spoke of what they'd lost, only of what still remained. One night, lightning struck near the ridge, lighting the sky with fire. A storm moved in fast, rain pounding the roof like hooves on dry earth. May rushed to close the shutters while Eli secured the animals. In the chaos, they moved like a team, every step in sync. Afterward, soaked to the bone but safe, May poured 2 cups of coffee and said with a smirk, "You're starting to earn that roof." Eli didn't laugh. He just raised his cup and nodded, his way of saying, "Thank you for choosing me." But Duke Harmon wasn't done. He was gathering men, angry men, drunken men, Men who believed land should only be owned by bloodlines and power. Men who despised the idea of a boy and a widow defending a patch of earth with nothing but grit and guts. And when men like that gather, they don't just want land. They want to prove a point. May and Eli sensed it. The animals grew restless. The nights grew quieter, too quiet. It was the kind of stillness the desert holds before it breaks into violence. They prepared without words. Ammo was counted, water barrels filled, and the last fence post was hammered in with the kind of determination that says, "This is home, and we will not run." In the Old West, sometimes the only way to hold on to something was to be willing to die for it. The first shot came just before dawn. A sharp crack split the air, followed by the whinny of a frightened horse. Eli bolted upright from the floor, where he'd been resting, already clutching the rifle before his eyes fully opened. May was standing at the window, calm, unflinching. "They've come," she said, as if announcing the arrival of a guest long expected. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She had buried a warrior once. She would not bury a boy without a fight. Outside, 5 riders circled the property like wolves. One fired into the sky, a signal, a warning, or perhaps a taunt. Eli breathed slowly, just as May had taught him. She handed him a pouch of bullets. "Only shoot if they step past the fence," she instructed. "We're not killers. Not unless they leave us no choice." He nodded. His mouth was dry, his chest tight, but his heart did not falter, because what he was protecting wasn't just a cabin. It was the only place that had ever felt like a promise. They waited in silence as the riders dismounted. Dust settled. Boots hit dirt. The man in front wasn't Duke, but someone meaner, younger, with eyes like shattered glass. "We ain't here to kill nobody," he shouted. "Just to take what's ours." May stepped onto the porch, shotgun cradled in her arms. "Then you'll leave empty-handed," she said. "There's nothing here for thieves." Her voice echoed across the land like a church bell calling judgment. The standoff stretched into eternity. No one blinked. No one moved. Then, one of the men twitched toward his holster. A single shot rang out. Not from May. Not from a gang. From Eli. The man dropped, screaming, his hand bloodied, his pistol clattering to the ground. The others froze. May didn't turn to look at Eli. She just said, "Now you know who you're dealing with." The remaining men backed away, dragging their wounded comrade, hearts pounding with disbelief. A boy had defended a woman with the resolve of 100 men. After they vanished into the hills, May sat beside Eli on the porch. He said nothing. She said nothing. The silence was different now. Not heavy, but earned. He had crossed a threshold, stepped into a space where boys become something more, not because they want to, but because the world gives them no other option. May looked at him and said softly he would have been proud. Eli didn't ask who. He knew. And deep down, he hoped he'd live a life worthy of that legacy. News traveled faster than horses in the West. By sundown, the town knew what had happened. A boy had held off a gang. A widow had stood her ground once more. And together, they had redrawn the lines of what power looked like. In the saloon, old men whispered with reverence. Young drifters eyed the cabin on the hill with something like awe. Even the sheriff, long silent, tipped his hat when May passed him on the street. Some rules, it seemed, were changing, but peace was never permanent. Not here. Duke Harmon returned 2 days later, this time alone, wearing black gloves and a look that belonged to a man who had nothing left to lose. He found May outside the general store, picking up supplies. Eli was tying the horses nearby. Duke didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply said, "You made me a fool." May didn't stop walking. "No, Duke," she replied. "You did that to yourself." Those words, quiet as they were, shattered something in him. He lunged, fast, reckless, but Eli was faster. In a single movement, he tackled Duke to the ground, the knife Duke had hidden in his belt skidding across the dirt. Townsfolk gasped. The sheriff ran forward. But it was May who pulled Eli back, her grip firm. "Let him go," she commanded. "He's not worth your rage." Eli stepped back, breathing hard, fists still clenched. Duke lay in the dust, defeated not by bullets or blades, but by the fact that the people around him no longer feared his name. The sheriff arrested Duke on the spot. No trial was needed. The town had seen everything, and for the first time, the law stood on May's side. Not because they loved her, but because they could no longer deny the truth. She wasn't a threat. She was a protector. And Eli, he was more than a boy. He was proof that love, even when born from ashes, could grow into something fierce enough to change the course of a town. Later, back at the cabin, Eli helped May unload the wagon. The wind was calm, the sky clear. May handed him a wrapped bundle. Inside, a journal with worn leather binding. She said simply. Eli opened it carefully. Notes, maps, stories. All from the warrior whose name still echoed in the hills. You're part of this now, May said. Not because I chose you, but because you chose to stay. Eli looked up, and for the first time, truly believed he belonged. The days that followed were unusually quiet. The land seemed to breathe again, as if exhaling a long-held tension. May returned to her routines, but with a softness that hadn't been there before. She no longer moved like someone waiting for war. And Eli, he walked the property like a sentinel, not because he feared what was coming, but because he'd learned the value of what was already his. Every sunrise was no longer a warning. It was a reward. One morning, May handed him a slip of parchment. It was the deed to the land, her land. His eyes widened as he held it, fingers trembling. I'm not going anywhere yet, she said with a smirk. But when I do, this shouldn't go to dust or vultures. Eli didn't know what to say. The West didn't teach boys how to cry, but something behind his eyes welled up like spring water. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it away, not in his pocket, but in the journal of the fallen warrior. It belonged there now. Eli built a new fence that week, not because it was needed, but because the act felt sacred. With each post hammered in, he remembered the boy he used to be, lost, silent, unwanted. And with each post, he buried a little more of that boy beneath the dust. The orphan was gone. In his place stood someone worthy of a name, a home, and a story worth telling. Not because he had survived, but because he had chosen to fight for what mattered. May watched him often from the porch, sipping coffee from the same old tin cup. Sometimes she saw her late husband in Eli's stance, in the way he surveyed the horizon. But more often, she saw something new, something neither of them had ever been allowed to be, at peace. There were still dangers beyond the hills, of course. Bandits, drought, time. But for now, they had carved out a space where peace could live, however briefly. And in the West, that was everything. It wasn't gold or land that defined a life. It was the moments you stood your ground, the hands you chose to hold, the promises kept when no one else was watching. May and Eli had nothing written in blood to bind them, but the world had watched as they defied it. And in doing so, they wrote a legend the West would not soon forget. One night, as a gentle breeze carried the scent of sagebrush through the open windows, Eli sat by the fire, journal in hand. The words of the warrior, May's late husband, seemed to come alive in the glow of the flames. He spoke of honor, silence, sacrifice, but he also wrote of loneliness, of the ache that comes from guarding something no one else understands. Eli closed the book slowly and looked over at May, who was dozing in her rocker, peaceful at last. He stepped outside and looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched him sleep cold under trees, that had seen him cry without sound, that had once made him feel small. But tonight, they looked different, not because they had changed, but because he had. He wasn't just a survivor. He was someone who had been found, not by accident, but by grace. May's grace, the land's grace. And now, it was his turn to give it back. From that night on, Eli became something more than a boy with a past. He became a man with a mission. He started helping others, orphans, widows, strangers passing through. He never said much. He never asked for thanks. But those who received his kindness felt something ancient in his gaze, something earned, not given. And they passed his name from town to town, from fire pit to fire pit, the way only legends travel in the West. May lived to see him grow into that legacy. And when her time came, there were no tears, no regrets. She passed quietly in the night, a hand resting on the deed she had signed over, a faint smile on her lips. Eli buried her beside the warrior, under the lone tree on the hill, and carved her name into the stone with his own hands. Not as a widow, not as a woman feared, but as the one who taught him what home meant. And so the cabin stood, weathered but strong, with smoke rising from its chimney once again. A place once haunted by ghosts had become a refuge for stories. And anyone who knocked on that door, seeking only a roof, was met by a man who knew exactly what it meant to be chosen and what it meant to stay. In the unforgiving silence of the West, where law often came too late and justice too rarely, stories like Eli and May's were not whispered. They were carved into the bones of the land. What began as a boy's desperate search for shelter became a story of transformation, loyalty, and the kind of bond that defies every written rule. He didn't arrive seeking family. She didn't open her door looking for redemption. And yet, both found what they didn't even know they needed: each other. May didn't rescue Eli out of pity. She gave him something far more dangerous: trust. And Eli, in return, gave her what the world had long tried to steal: hope. Through gunfire, threats, and the weight of judgment, they built not just a home, but a legacy. A legacy not rooted in blood, but in choice. In the Old West, where even the rain seemed to ask for permission before it fell, choosing someone was an act of rebellion. And protecting them, that was an act of love. The cabin still stands because two people stood taller than the fear around them. And though the world tried to label them widow, orphan, outcast, they redefined themselves on their own terms. That's the beauty of stories like this. They remind us that family is not always born. Sometimes it is made, forged in hardship, sealed in silence, and strengthened in the fire of shared purpose. And when it is, not even time can erase it. So if you've ever felt like you didn't belong, like the world had no place for you, remember Eli. Remember May. And remember that sometimes all it takes is one open door to rewrite a life. The West may be dust now, but the echoes of its truths still ride the wind. Truths about courage, loyalty, and how the smallest acts of kindness can shift the course of a life forever. If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let your voice echo in the comments. What would you have done in Eli's boots? Or May's? Every story needs a witness, and now you're part of this one.